Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. We're getting ready to get started. Thank you very much for being with us.
Hi, Holly.
Hi, Scott. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Hello, Andrea. Nice to see you again. Been a long time.
Hi, I can't see who's talking, but I will. Oh, there you are, Scott. I see you. It is nice to see you.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Holly, for playing such wonderful music at the start. That's Abusive Junction by Kokoroko. I'm glad someone recognized in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Amanda Pulishi. I'm the Associate Director of Leadership and Community Building Programs at SFU with responsibility for the Climate Action Certificate. I'm really happy to be here with you today alongside our Program Manager, Holly Okara. Holly, if you can give us a little wave, and our Program Assistant, Margaret Marriott. We're grateful to be with you so that you can know and recognize some of the folks who would be so happy to hear from you at our climate@sfu.ca email, and who I think may have communicated with us, a few of you, a little bit before now. Later, you'll also hear from one of our key instructors and course developers of the certificate, Andrea Reimer, who will share some insights from her experience as an instructor working in this field. I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory, lands of the Niitsitapi or Blackfoot and Nahiak peoples, or Cree peoples in what is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta. Our program team is joining from the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I know that folks are joining from many different lands, including the Katzie, the Coquitlam, the Kakite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Swatsons peoples. Our intention as a team supporting these programs is not only to deliver a positive and meaningful learning experience, but also more broadly to build reciprocal and respectful relationships toward education that is equitable, decolonized, inclusive, and as accessible as possible. I want to recognize how these principles are modeled within Indigenous pedagogy and ways of knowing, and just name that I feel a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility to those who have stewarded this land from the beginning of time. I believe that relationships are foundational to learning. It means so much to have each of you with us, to take the time to learn about this program, to learn how you can get involved. And with the Climate Action Certificate in particular, I think it's really important to name and recognize Indigenous knowledge, stewardship, and protection in climate action since time immemorial. Our commitment is to continually learn from Indigenous leadership in these fields. And as you will see, as we learn about the program, we are committed to weaving in knowledge from Indigenous leadership into all of the courses and certificates, not only in climate action, but in all of lifelong learning at SFU. If you'd like to find out more about the people who have stewarded and protected the lands that you're on, we'll add a link in the chat, nativeland.ca, which is a resource where you can find out more. We'll move on to our next slide. So in the spirit of building relationships, our agenda will start out with introductions. We'll find out more about who's in the room. In a moment, we'll ask you to share in the chat your name, your work context, what interests you in the certificate. Then you'll hear an overview of the courses and what you can expect within the Climate Action Certificate and our goals for these programs. Then we'll hear insight from Andrea Reimer, who's one of the instructors, who's also championed the certificate since it was first conceived and had been an instrumental part of bringing it to life. And then we'll close with questions. I'll note for questions, you can absolutely feel free to add questions to the chat throughout. If we're not able to address it in the moment, we'll do our best to gather them separately for the end when we can have a dialogue with you as well. The last thing I'll note about our agenda is that I recognize that you have taken time out of your day to be with us and to learn about these sessions. That time is incredibly valuable. Our hope is that even if you don't end up signing up for the certificate or the course, that you will learn something that can be useful to you in the goals that you have around being involved in climate action. So with that, I'll add, please tell us about yourself in the chat. This can be your name, your work context, and what interests you in the climate action certificate. So give us a moment for Margaret to add that prompt. Thank you, Margaret, for adding nativeland.ca as well as the prompt. And you can go ahead and let us know a little bit about you in the chat. While you're adding those intros and typing them, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll really happy to tell you a bit more broad information about the Climate Action Certificate overall. So this is our program overview. Heading to the next slide, and we'll keep those intros coming. If the chat is distracting for you, we'll have a moment to pause before we head into question period to make sure that you can capture some of what you've learned. So as you can see, and as you likely know, our hopes with the overall certificate is to address a gap that we hear from community members, from government, employers, from industry, and many others who want to be part of climate solutions and who want to be a part of facilitating a better future related to climate change. We know that scientific solutions to climate change exist, but lack of action is causing climate emergency to emerge as one of the biggest threats to our collective future. You may be here because you've wondered, what can I do to get involved? What can one person do? Or perhaps you've wondered, how can I facilitate climate action strategy or actions at my workplace, in my community? Our hope in this program is to empower individuals and your networks to be problem solvers and agents so that you can be more equipped with practical skills, with knowledge and strategies to collectively overcome systemic barriers, to apply effective solutions, and to lead and implement equitable climate change plans. I know I'm moving a little bit quickly, so I'll pause just to see that folks are sharing their intros in the chat. Thank you so much, Dustin, Josh, Sue, Ariel, Maya, Meredith, Ashish. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. I hope you can forgive my pronunciation. We're very glad that you're with us and sharing more about what brings you here. Heading now into why this program. So this program was designed for anyone working in government, planning, engineering, or other sectors impacted by climate change, as well as, oh, hello there. I think we've got someone off mute. Hi, Scott. Did you have a question? I think we've got it. Okay, I'll keep going then. So it's not just folks working in government, engineering, and other sectors, but also community members and those who are working in industries who want to be part of the solution. When I say work, I want to be clear that work happens in both paid and unpaid contexts as community members take action. I also want to be clear that anyone impacted includes everyone, all of us. Many folks joining these programs includes people whose areas of professional work are both directly connected to climate change as well as adjacent. We've had learners in the programs who work in community service or frontline roles, who work in construction and manufacturing, who work in education, journalism, as well as people who are directly connected to climate-focused industries. This issue affects all of us, and as you know, is increasingly relevant to a wide range of sectors. The Climate Action Certificate is intended to be flexible. It can be completed asynchronously or in your own time. The typical duration for courses is about 6 weeks, although there are 2 courses that are longer, 8 and 12 weeks. You can take individual courses. You can also sign up to take the full certificate that can be completed within 36 months or 3 years. So depending on your work schedule, your family schedule, there are a lot of different ways to become involved and to complete the certificate. There are 3 core components to the climate action certificate, which are required courses, which are the foundations in climate change, Indigenous perspectives in climate change, as well as climate justice, building just and equitable communities. There are also electives that you can take. These cover a broad range of fundamental topics, from the basics of climate science to climate communication, tools for building community resilience. Taking this course means that you'll also learn principles of climate justice and Indigenous knowledge systems that can be related to your work and how you can apply that to advancing your role within climate leadership and working alongside and in solidarity with Indigenous communities. The information on these slides is also on the program website, and we're happy to talk in more detail about any of these courses. I'll name as well that Navigating Power for Climate Action, CLM 525, which is taught by Andrea Reimer, and we'll pass to her in a moment for additional insights from her experience developing and instructing that course. I'm seeing some really wonderful introductions happening in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing a little bit more about yourself so that we can know who we are in the room with. I'll hand it now to the next slide as we're getting ready and passing to Andrea. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being with us and for sharing some of the insights that you have as an instructor and a leader in this field. I'll add your bio in the chat. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Andrea Reimer. You can see my bio in the chat there. I am joining you today from the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I feel compelled to mention last night I was at the book launch for the Squamish have a new book out that is chronicling their history and inviting you to walk through that history with them. And I was telling the team a little bit about it to invite you to consider purchasing this book, but also just how incredible this journey has been. Like, it's one thing to produce a book, that's a lot of work from what I'm told, but to consider that this is the first time in 100 years that they've been able to tell their story in their words in that way, and how profound that is. Like the layers of work of generations that have had to happen to build the power to be able to do that. Again, I don't know that we're post-colonization, but as we're moving through this period of reconciliation. So it was quite a powerful evening, and just really reinforced for me how important it is for us to do the acknowledgements and reflect on what it means to us. Thank you so much, Amanda, for putting it in the chat, the name. It's pronounced Tanacheti Tameo, if you're wondering what that is, what it says there. Tameo is the Squamish word for land, so it's a good one to know when you're thinking about land acknowledgements. Okay, so you can read a bit about me in the chat, but I feel like to give you the background as to how I decided to make room in my life for 18 months to develop a 9-course climate action certificate, it might help to emphasize a few parts of that bio. So I've been working on climate action for a long time. I started in the mid-1990s because I was working at a place called the Western Canada Wilderness Committee. Our work was focused on conservation of wild places and the species that live in those wild places. And we viewed our role as drawing lines on a map, getting legislation passed that things within those lines were protected, and then also finding legislation to protect species who, of course, don't necessarily look at maps when they're thinking about where they're going to go. So we were doing that work, and suddenly there was a terrible forest fire year in Edmonton. It was in 1996. Amanda, you may remember that year. There was these, really, now they don't even seem unusual, those photos, but at the time it was quite profound. And I started doing some research because it had never occurred to us that there would be threats to these areas that were out of our control, that you couldn't just put a gate and be like, this is a park, right? That something like climate change could come in and destroy these wilderness areas. So I started learning about climate change and started working with others. And at the time, I mean, 30 years ago, it was actually not a very common conversation to have. So it was a bit of a long journey, but eventually ended up getting elected. I was the first elected Green Party person in Canada. I was elected to the Vancouver School Board and worked on climate change issues there in the early 2000s. Then was one of the first Al Gore trainees in Canada, well, one of the first generally, but in Canada specifically, and worked through that to try and get the message out through his Inconvenient Truth. I was still working at the Wilderness Committee, got elected to the City Council in Vancouver, led the Greenest City Action Plan. We were the first major city in the Americas to commit to getting off fossil fuels, and we did a whole host of actions on that. I've sat on way too many boards, and through all of that was like seeing people, both boards that were there for the purpose of mobilizing action on climate, but those that were not, but felt the push to do something about this increasingly urgent issue. And through all of that, my main approach over 30 years was pushing technical solutions, because we do need technical solutions to climate change. But what I saw over and over and over again, that the success was not being defined by whether or not the technology existed, because that's existed for a long time. It was being determined by how effective you were at navigating the systems and structures that you needed to navigate to get that technology landed, and the worldviews, beliefs, and paradigms. And so after I left council, which was a conscious, I made a choice to leave council. I felt I needed to get out. I was elected for 4 terms and kind of needed to see the world from a different perspective than inside government. I became aware of this research done by a woman named Karen O'Brien. And what she similarly, when she was a scientist who was involved in the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that won the Nobel Prize in 2007. And she's like, great, everybody's recognized the work, everything's going to change. And then in 2017, she's like, nothing's really changed. Why is that, right? Like, we know what we need to do. Why aren't people acting? And so she took her knowledge, she's a sociologist, and looked at why that's not happening. And so what her research said was this, that here in the middle, you have technical responses to climate change. It actually, if you look at this green wedge, has very little outcomes. So we could put 100 hours into working on technical solutions and get this little wedge, or we could put 100 hours into challenging the systems and structures and get this much bigger wedge. Or we could put 100 hours into taking on beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms and figuring out how to shift those, and we get much bigger outcomes. And so that's where the certificate was really born, was in this idea of, yes, we absolutely need technical, but we need to start upping our toolkits and our skills on challenging and navigating systems and structures, power, and on how we interact with beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. And can we shift those, right? How do we build bridges and shift those? And so the programs that we've offered to you in the certificate are very much focused on that theory of change. We do have a foundation course, because one of the things I see over and over again is that people think, let me rewind a bit. Many years ago, when I'd use a computer, I'm self-taught on using a computer, as are most of us. And I had a young man say, why do you do it that way? And I'm like, what way? He's like, well, if you just press this button, you could avoid those 10 buttons you just pressed. And me being like, huh, okay, that's really interesting. Like, so I never built the foundations that I needed to be able to use a computer as effectively as I could. And I think the same is true on climate. If you're working in a municipality and your job wasn't climate, but somebody came in your office and said, we really need you working on climate, or if you're working in a university or another environment like that, or you've been very passionate about climate based on things you've heard, but you actually, if really tested on certain things, don't feel confident about what you know and don't know. And so the foundations course was really about that. We have 3 kind of meta ideas we looked at in this. We want it to be power informed, to recognize that power exists and that you must navigate it in order to be effective at climate action. We wanted, like, flowing from that, right relations with Indigenous people is a fundamental practice that must exist for us to get to climate action in a good way. And also that justice, and climate justice particularly, is important. And so you'll see that woven throughout the program. So the first module is very much based on those 3 concepts, that you have Foundations in Climate Action, Indigenous Perspectives in Climate Action, and the Climate Justice. So that those are the core courses in the certificate. And then we have a number of electives that try to meet you where you're at. So I hear from particularly local government folks, well, let me rephrase that, government folks. There just happens to be like more local government folks across the country because of the sheer number of local governments. But I hear from them all the time about the challenges they have with climate communications. So we really wanted to give you a course that was like kind of like the equivalent of a boot camp on communication. So from like soup to nuts, how you take all these great principles that you can Google online and find PDFs about, but you're like, how do I actually translate that into practice? So to give you an environment where you can learn the basics, but also learn how that beyond the basics, how that actually works in practice, because that's where things get complicated. I teach a class called Navigating Power for Collective Action. I teach essentially a very similar class at UBC in the grad program out there for public policy. I think what I love about this is the one that I do out there is more academic, more theoretical. This one just gives you such a practical ability to look and reflect on your own power, gives you language about power, because power is like this thing, like more than sex or money, a thing we're not supposed to talk about, right? So we don't have language for it. So it becomes very hard to navigate power. In the class, you learn not only that there's language to use around power, but that you have a lot more than you think you do. And also that you can not only see the power other people have, but you can map it. And once you can map it, you can navigate it and do that effectively. So if you add navigating power and climate communications together, suddenly you've kind of supercharged your campaigns, right? So it may have started with a technical desire to bring in an EV program or transition to a renewable energy structure, but these barriers that you keep coming up against suddenly kind of, I'm not going to say they melt away, but you feel confident that you can effectively challenge those barriers and be able to go over them or through them or maybe even around them in some cases. We have a really good course. Sorry, they're all great courses, but one of the ones that I think it's kind of, I would definitely say it's for people who have tried everything I've talked about already and are like, this still isn't working, Andrea, so what do I do about it? It's called Building Community Resilience in the Climate Emergency. So this is really about looking at the systems and structures of the community that you're in, not a community, but your community, and being able to build the tools that you need to work with what you've got. To respond to the climate emergency, whether that's adaptation, so you're dealing with floods or fires or other kinds of I was going to say infrastructure impacts. This is my local government time, but it's not just infrastructure, it's the people that lives in that infrastructure or needs to drive on it or move on it. And the very real impact that all of those floods and fires are having on our relationships, right? Our social infrastructure as well. But it also looks at how you build community resilience against extremism and polarization. So how do you deal with the fact that talking about carbon tax can be a very polarizing discussion in a community? So, or a bike lane, or ask me about bike lanes sometimes. So like, how do you actually use the assets in your community, not a community, but your community, and use them to be able to build the resilience you need to have the discussions that you need to have or take the actions you need to take. We do have a couple of technical courses because it is, as I said, important. So climate action in smaller communities was really, I mean, I'm sure there's some of you on the call. I saw it in the chat actually, and maybe some more that haven't outed themselves, but you're coming from very small municipalities, even medium-sized ones, or institutions like universities, which are essentially like small municipalities or even medium municipalities. And you looking at all the stuff that's out there and you're like, well, we can't do that. We're just not big enough, right? We're not Vancouver, we're not Montreal, we're not Toronto. And so we wanted a course that just was really let you take the capacity that you have, a tremendous amount of free information, tools, or low cost things that you can access and really like just really plugging you into those things. It gives you a practical list of current places that you can go for funding. The people that teach the course come from the Community Energy Association, so they have on the ground, day-to-day experience in communities across British Columbia and Alberta and other parts of Canada, more concentrated here in BC and Alberta, but they are on the ground in other places. And they can tell you today where your funding opportunities are, where your resource opportunities are, and help you build a plan. The course is based on you building a plan for your community with the information. Green Infrastructure is a course that pre-existed the certificate, a fantastic course looking at how you bring green infrastructure into your community. If that means nothing to you, what a good opportunity to take this course and find out what it means. It's really about how do we, instead of paving or building concrete structures, how do we use natural structures to be able to manage things in an urban environment better? And one of the primary things that we're trying to manage is water. So cities, I'm trying to remember the axiom for this. The only time you don't the only time you notice how cities are managing water is when things are going very poorly. But most of the time, water is running under you or over you in ways that you just don't notice, right? And so how you manage this water in an environment where rain events are becoming much more extreme than they were, so flooding events, how cities manage that is a very critical question. And being able to do it, you're never going to be able to imagine how big the pipe you're going to need is going to be 10 years from now. So then how do you use natural systems to manage it? And the last one is closely related, the strategic dialogue and engagement for climate adaptation, very closely related to building community resilience, but focused on taking those techniques and really moving them into adaptation planning for your community. So altogether, a really fantastic basket of things for you to pull from. Great foundation with the 3 courses, the foundations, Indigenous perspectives and climate justice. And then there's like a menu there that I can guarantee you, whatever problem you're dealing with in your municipality, there's very practical tools and resources that are given to you and the support to be able to put them into practice week to week and come back to an experienced instructor who can be like, yes, like that worked, or no, that didn't work, but let's look at like why that didn't work and how we can do things differently. Great. Thank you very much for sharing the screen. And as you can see, we've got some coming up very soon, the Indigenous Perspectives and Climate Justice. And then Lindsay and I will be teaching Navigating Power in the fall. You might notice there's some co-teaching here. One of our other theories of change has really been around building capacity for the work. It is all women doing these courses. That is not by design. It just happened to be how it worked out. But I think it brings perspective that's important in the context we're talking about around power-informed and justice lens. I think I've talked a lot, Amanda, but I'm really happy to answer questions or follow up. Like you may have questions. You and I have never done this together before. So if you had questions, happy to follow up on those as well.
I think it's so fabulous, Andrea, to hear the passion and the experience you have, not only in your field and what brought you to the certificate, but also in working with each of these instructors in developing, as they developed each of their courses as part of a broader certificate. I think we're ready to answer questions from the room. I noticed that there's a first question in the chat. I think it was from Ashish? Ashish, can you let me know, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Ashish asked, can you please provide some additional details of one of the required courses, Indigenous Perspectives and Climate Action, CLM 425? Also, please let us know whether there would be specific case studies or examples directly related to two-eyed seeing approach application and implementation. So two-eyed seeing, for context, I'm going to be drawing directly from Lindsay Heller's course. Two-eyed seeing in the Mi'kmaq language, I'm going to put the term is an approach to learning, understanding, and problem solving that emphasizes integrating Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing alongside Western ways of knowing. It was coined by Elder Albert Marshall. And so I can say that in this course, module 2 in particular is really focused on two-eyed seeing. There's a required reading and video. I'm happy to share the video in the chat as an example of some of the approach to two-eyed seeing that you'll hear in this course. And then Lindsay has prepared applications and examples. The component, the requirement from students is to reflect on these examples to identify what you learn, how it applies to your context. And so I'll just put that information in the chat. Does that give you a bit more perspective, or do you have a follow-up question?
No, yes, it did. No, thank you very much. I was just curious as to how, how far you can go into those, application or case studies within the scope of the certificate course or a single course. No, thank you very much.
I appreciate that. One of the 6 modules is entirely focused on two-eyed seeing, and there's a video link in the chat from Albert Marshall with his approach that's also linked in the course, and something that you would engage with more deeply in that program.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, Lindsay's amazing. I mean, she's been with us. We had a little group of us that designed the program, and she was one of the folks I invited into that original design circle, as is Lindsay Popes, the 2 Lindsays, one as an I, one as a Y. And Lindsay Heller, so she's Indigenous, and she has a very strong academic background. She's really like her life has been spent in academia, but it's so incredible to watch how she's been able to take an Indigenous worldview and way of knowing and translate it into an online asynchronous environment, so where people are self-paced. It's been a real struggle. It was a lot of work for her to do that, but I think a real opportunity for you to see, not just learn about two-eyed seeing, but to see it in practice as she plays it out through the course, how she's integrated it into that.
Thank you so much for that question, Ashish, and for that additional response, Andrea. So we have the next question is from Vijitha. Vijitha, can you let me know, am I addressing you respectfully? I hope that I'm close.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
You did good. Yeah, thanks.
Vijitha asks, I understand this climate action certificate is listed under eligible courses for Stronger BC's Future Skills Grant. Are the CLM 435 and 425 starting in May 2024 eligible for this grant? So the way, for those of you who don't know, the Stronger BC's Future Grant is run through the provincial government. It enables and offers $3,500 of eligible funding for every adult in BC for specific courses and certificates that fall under their approved list. All of the climate action courses were on that approved list for fall 2023. And so for spring 2024, what the provincial government has said, if you're a midstream learner, if you've already taken courses in fall and you've registered for a certificate, then yes, the May 2024 courses would be in the spring. You'd be a midstream learner and those would be funded. So if this would be your first course under the grant, my understanding from the province is that if it's your first course in spring, no. But they've announced on their website that they will be restarting the program in fall 2024 and to keep an eye out for details. When that is announced, we will absolutely be making a note out through our email list to let people know what the status of eligibility is. My hope is that it will be a similar eligibility as it was last fall, where those courses continue to be eligible for funding, which would mean if you start in fall and register for the certificate, they would be eligible for funding. However, that hasn't been officially announced from the province yet, and we will be putting out that information. Holly and Margaret, is there any additional info that I should give people a heads up? The main thing is to follow the email list, because as soon as they send out that notification, we'll be absolutely letting folks know which of the climate action courses are eligible for new learners and which ones are eligible for midstream. Vijitha, does that answer your question? Do you have any follow-up? I'm happy to add that link in the chat, or I think Margaret probably already has, for where to follow our newsletter.
Yes, that helps. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you very much for your question. All right, this next question, I think we'll start, Andrea, if you have a response, and then I'll have one as well. This is from Regina. Do you feel and Regina, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly as well.
You did. Yeah, perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Do you feel the information is transferable across Canada? As mentioned, I am representing a group from Southern Labrador with a total of 8 isolated diesel communities, just ensuring that the information presented in this course is a fulsome approach for varied perspectives. So I'll start with Andrea, and then I have a few thoughts as well and an example from the smaller communities course.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Well, I would say the simple answer is yes. And the one I would have pointed to is smaller communities, which we really worked hard to make sure was applicable, not just across the country, but really like I think one of our primary audience is rural and remote communities who just have so few other avenues to get this information. But I would also say that like the climate communication is not context specific. Like it's intended to be a set of tools that the instructor then works with you to land in your context, if that makes some sense. The navigating power for collective action, it doesn't even need to be climate. Like it could be any issue that you want to navigate power for collective action on. It would be applicable too. And the other ones, the building community resilience and the strategic dialogue and engagement, I think would also be very applicable. The foundations courses, I think they would absolutely be applicable. I think though that you might not see yourself as well reflected in those as you might in the others. So in the material, I think it would be us working with the instructor when we see you registered to make sure that the course material, like the examples and things that the instructor is using each week, have some relevance and connection to your context.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
And I'll add that in the climate action in smaller communities, I was specifically thinking of case studies. I know that in one of the modules, they have a number of case studies, including one from Eastern Canada that may resonate with some of the work that you're doing. If I'm able to find, if you are willing to write to climate@sfu.ca afterwards, I'll be happy to see if I can find that specific case study.
Certainly.
Do know that there are similar communities referenced within the course that you might find resonate with the work that you're doing as well.
Perfect. Appreciate that. I'll send along an email following this.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, our next.
Amanda, okay,
go
you
ahead,
got
Anne.
it. No, I was just wondering if you could see the question or not, but I'll stop talking.
Oh, never. Our next question I'll read aloud from Sue. Regina has a great question. Regina asks, as do courses include peatland, wetlands, and all coastal areas in Canada, higher temperatures, less permafrost, flooding, and fires, and the funds for all, plus any restoration can be started. So to make sure I understand this correctly, your question is asking about, do the courses include these different regions, peatlands, wetlands, and do they reference higher temperatures, less permafrost? And you note the funds for all plus any restoration. And so I'm seeing a few different parts of your question. One is is there reference to different areas that are impacted by climate? I can say absolutely yes, that is referenced throughout the certificate. In terms of accessing addressing the impacts of climate action, I would say absolutely. The Foundations in Climate Action course in particular gives an overview of a lot of those impacts. And I know that as well, there are a number of courses that address when in part of building collective action, how to resource this work. As I was just looking at the smaller communities climate action, I know that there's a section in that course that discusses resourcing and funding that's specific to smaller communities. I know that that comes up in Principles to Practice as well in 515. Andrea, do you have any other thoughts on areas that the certificate touches on some of the issues that are addressed in Sue's comment?
Yeah, I think you did a good summary. I know the Indigenous perspectives, it's also covered because we wanted to make sure that I think one of the challenges for us down here in the far southwestern corner of the country is that it can when we say Indigenous, we often mean First Nation, maybe Métis, but very rarely Inuit. And we wanted to make sure that those perspectives were well covered in the Indigenous perspectives and climate action. The climate, sorry, I was going to say quite a few of the courses, like once you move into the electives, the communication power, community resilience, those three in particular don't really, I mean, it's a lot to get through in 6 weeks, so they don't ground you in here are the impacts of climate change, right? We're making a presumption, particularly if you're taking the certificate, that you've already or will be taking the foundations program or an Indigenous and climate justice. So we're not covering that again in our courses, although we do point you in the direction of resources if you're just taking a more a la carte approach where you're doing one course.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Sue, did you have any follow-up questions? Did that answer your question? If you do have a follow-up question at any point, we'd be really happy to hear it in the chat. Oh, perfect. So by resource, could you expand?
I mean, yes, although I'm not sure once I start talking that you're going to want me to. So for my course, for example, we have over 10 pages of links to resources that you can use. The climate communications, I think, has even more than that. Foundations has quite a lot of resources that she has listed there. The small communities, it's very tool and resource based. Obviously, not all of them are going to be applicable in every community, but that's one of the reasons these resource lists are so long. So I would say all of the courses have quite a resource-rich environment. So trying to point you in the direction of online or, I mean, very little. You can write away to governments and get them to send you things that if you don't have the capacity to access them online, but we're mostly giving you access to online resources from either governments or nonprofit organizations. In my case, and I think it's also true of climate justice, some of them are not available online, but we're giving you access to them. They're either handbooks or other things, handouts, handbooks, worksheets that we've developed specifically that you can then use within those 8 communities, for example, if you wanted to workshop power mapping with them or something. We're giving you tools that you can take away and use in those different contexts.
I'll note as well that I know there's an effort as the program was launched last year. I see a great effort among the instructional team to refresh resources, whether it's adding new interviews from speakers, whether it's adding emerging research. I know that there's a process in terms of ensuring that the learning materials are as relevant and up to date as possible. I noticed as well that mention of accounting and reporting. And so one of the ways that I use the term resource was resourcing this work. And I know that there's a model, particularly in climate justice for smaller communities, where they talk about grant funding and other pieces that are related to how communities can explore working alongside federal and provincial initiatives. And so I know that that's referenced in smaller communities, if that's the way that we meant resourcing.
Yeah, I'm just giving, I realize that resource, I'm thinking of resource as a synonym for tool or a thing as opposed to like an asset. I don't know. I feel like we're using the word resource in 2 different ways, but I'm struggling to find a precise definition. But to give you some examples, I'm more of a show don't tell type. I've given you 2 links that I was working with this morning, actually, for another power course that I do. One of them is from Restorative Justice and Equal Justice USA, and it's a step-by-step guide to how to identify allies and collaborative partners in your community. So that's one example, and I would say that falls much more into the toolkit resources. So it's got like quite a lot of sublinks that send you off to different tools you can use. The other one I gave you, which I would say is an example of a government resource, it comes from the government of BC. It is one of the best resources available in Canada right now, and it was a document that they created. It's called the Policy Approaches Playbook. It was a document that they created because they have all these staff that have to create policy, and they were finding that their own staff didn't necessarily understand what that meant. And so they created this quite concise document that explains how policy gets made in government. It's fantastic. And I think required reading for anyone who's trying to move policy change through particularly the BC government, but I think it would be transferable across pretty much every provincial context in Canada.
In addition, in using the resourcing the other way, I'm just going to share a note and acknowledge, Sue, the delays in funding, the difficulty of smaller communities to access government level funding. There's a section in smaller communities. I'm just going to include a bullet point directly from some of these notes with some of the example models that they're looking at in terms of how smaller communities can be resourcing this, whether that's how folks in the case studies are creating a climate action reserve fund, whether there's a revolving fund that a smaller community can create and set up for the future, or looking at how it's allocated in budget. So I think that also gets very specific in terms of the other ways that folks are navigating the difficulties that you describe in the chat. I hope
And
that's
then
yeah.
Yeah, and I would say on that, then they further give you, so I noticed they're like to set up your own local tax. So they give you resources as to how you would do that, right? So tools that are available to you to look at case studies of where that's happened, what the actual legal parameters that are available to you to take that action are, and so on. And even if they're not familiar with your particular local context, because there's some like PEI Newfoundland might be outside of their knowledge. I actually don't know that. They do work with communities across Canada, but they would know where and how to find that information and track it down for you.
These are some really fabulous specific questions. I'll head to the next question from Ashish. Can you talk about whether you are using sex and gender-based analysis plus an intersectionality lens for these course topics included in each course? I'll share my response to this, and then I'll ask if you have any additional thoughts, Andrea. So my thoughts in terms of how the lens of intersectionality shows up in these courses, for those of you who don't know, intersectionality is a term coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how we can apply a lens that shows the ways that different marginalized identities interact with each other to create a worldview and shape things like bias and perspective and how they interact with power and oppression. And so there's a quote from the executive director of lifelong learning that I think really informs how I approach this topic. It's not something we do, it's the way that we do everything. I think that having a lens of intersectionality in centering and listening to marginalized voices, into looking at how, for the climate change specifically, how it directly impacts marginalized communities who have the least involvement in creating and fueling it. This interacts with gender, it interacts with other forms of oppression. It's relevant to every aspect of developing and delivering these programs. There are some places where it's named explicitly, but mostly it's implicit and the focus on within the focus of each of the modules of the courses. And so I can say that it's something that's important as part of the lens and the perspective of the people developing and supporting the courses. But it's not always explicit. Gender specifically is not always specifically named within each one of those courses, but it's embedded within the development. Andrea, do you have additional thoughts on that? I can also find some examples from some of the broader SFU conversation as well. Ashish, thank you for this great question.
Yeah, it is a really great question and allows me to fix an error in my explanation of the courses, an oversight. So this exact question was like, I remember the day in June 2022 when we were sitting in a room designing this, being like, how are we going to deal with this? And so what we decided to do is to create, it's a first of its kind. So it's been a really exciting process to be involved in. We created what we call the Jedi Primer course. And so in order to take any course within this certificate program, you must first take this foundational. It's a module, so it's equivalent to like 1 week of work. And it dives into all these topics because we didn't want a situation where each course was giving the same foundational information. And we all wanted to make sure that it was a safe space. I always hesitate to say it's going to be a safe space because, of course, it's out of our control. Like whether hurt or harm happens in a class, it's within our control to try and prepare that not to happen and to respond to it effectively. All to say, the Jedi Primer is super exciting and an opportunity to look at all these issues before you get started on any of them, and then allows us as instructors to link back to that primer.
Andrea, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. In my conversation about it's embedded within, how could I forget that this Jedi Primer was developed specifically for the climate action certificate, but is now being brought out to more and more courses at SFU as like a fundamental requirement in order to learn together and to create a safer and braver space within the programs. I see a question from Nusha. Nusha, can we turn to you for your question? Or I see your
Yes, yes, thank you so much. I apologize. I joined late, so you may have already addressed this, and I'm on the go. I wanted to ask about the structure of the course, the program. So depending on which elective we take, because they all have different start dates, we can finish the certificate either sooner or later. Am I right in interpreting that?
When you join the each course, the modules will be visible and you are able to complete them ahead of the recommended schedule. However, many of the courses include discussion prompts, and in order to get the benefit of a discussion prompt, there's a discussion, each discussion prompt has a designated week where people interact in the courses. But in terms of the actual assignments, reflection activities, skill building exercises, those can be completed ahead of the recommended schedule. Does that answer that you can complete it faster, but discussions happen during a designated time period for interaction?
No, for example, if like a couple of them like start in, for example, January 25 or like April 25, is that a start date? So depending on which elective I opt, I can finish the whole program sooner or later.
Yes, I understand. Depending
Okay.
on which electives you choose, you may decide to wait until one. Not all electives are offered each term. So yeah, you can finish it more quickly by taking electives that are offered closer together.
Got it. And then what is the recommendation for like concurrent courses? How many at a time?
Ooh, this is a really good question. I know this is kind of a non-answer. I think it really depends on the personal capacity and situation of the individual course. There are absolutely some folks who take 2 or 3 at a time, and there's some folks who take 1 at a time. Andrea, based on your experience of teaching the courses, do you have any additional thoughts on pacing, course load, any recommendations around how many folks would be able to take at one time?
Yeah, so hard because it depends on what else is going on in your life.
For sure.
I would say that we worked so hard, Nusha, to try and keep. So we've when you sign up for the courses or when you're looking at them, you'll see like this course takes approximately this many hours per week. We worked really hard to actually nail that. So Lindsay's course I'm looking at, it says prepare to spend about 8 hours per week on coursework. We had testers do that. We tried to take averages because different people have different writing or reading timelines. But we tried really hard because that's been an issue in the past where we're trying to cram in so much into our courses, and then your lives are busy, and we want you to learn. I always say I'd much rather you take one thing away from my course that you could actually put into practice than cram hundreds of things in that just sort of go in and out because you're so busy that you can't do the practical thing. One thing I might caution a tiny bit on, not caution, but just sort of flag, like the power course, for example, really is asking you to confront some pretty intense issues, right, around your own relationship with power. I don't know that I'd want to do 3 courses like that at one time. So I think some of like climate action in smaller communities and more technically focused, and the power one together, I think would be fine. Indigenous
Mhm.
perspectives and power might be a tough combo to do at one time.
Mhm. And are they assignments associated with any of them, or just no, like embedded quizzes, and once we're done, we are done, or any project or assessments involved?
Yeah, it's a pass fail system, so there's no like it's not graded. Well, I mean it's graded, but as to whether you completed the work to a standard that we would expect, but not like there's no difference between like getting over the line and not over the line. We tried to construct them all so that each week you have one quiz. So we're testing knowledge retention there or knowledge acquisition. We also, I think we all have journals every week of some kind of reflective exercise. And then on top of that, not every week, but often there's an assignment where I spoke a lot about it when I was explaining the courses. We're really trying to see and support you in putting these theories into practice, and then you being able to come back to us so that you can be like, I understood the theory, but it's not working in practice the way I wanted it to or the way I thought it might. And so that we can use our time in the program together to help support you to make the tool useful for you.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Great question, Nusha. And I'll add as well, regarding the course schedule, all of the core courses, the required courses are offered twice per year. Electives are offered at least once per year. If that helps you in mapping out a plan for completing the certificate.
It does help. Thank you.
I'm looking through the chat to see if there's any additional questions that we've missed. I'm encouraging folks as well. Please, we really appreciate your questions. We really appreciate connecting with you by email or by phone as you're preparing to connect with the certificate. You can connect with us at climate@sfu.ca. We also have a mailing list where we'll send out updates for when courses open, and as well that update for those of you who missed it earlier, when we hear the announcement from the province regarding the Future Skills Grant and whether courses will once again be eligible for full funding. That will go out through that mailing list as well. We do have time for one more question. And of course, we're available anytime for questions. Would we be best served by being directly involved with climate work while taking this course? Or is it okay if we're not currently into that role, hoping to get in? I'll answer briefly, then pass to Andrea. Please, absolutely. It is, you'll note from many folks, both in the chat today, and as well, we've heard from folks who have joined the courses. Many people are not working directly in climate focused fields. Either they're making a transition or they're seeing the applications at their current workplace. I mentioned earlier that folks have joined the program with a journalism background in education and industry and manufacturing. This the learning that happens around climate action applies to every role, every industry. It is increasingly becoming visible how obvious that is. Andrea, any additional thoughts on who should take this program?
Yeah, no, that was a great answer, Dustin. I so much appreciate that question. And I will fess up that the first year I taught the course, I tailored it entirely to people actively doing climate work, and learned my lesson that that was not a smart strategy, that the best way to get people who aren't yet involved in it involved is to give them an on-ramp. And I think meeting you halfway so that you can use the tools where they're valuable for you, and then see the application in a future career or action in climate work, I think is where we've moved my course and others to make sure that that opportunity exists. I will say the climate communications is fairly focused on climate communications because it's a very specific area that there's a very specific narrative that's developed against climate action. So it speaks to that. But I think there's lots to learn there that would still be of high interest to people who are generally interested in climate, but maybe don't have a specific project underway yet.
Thank you again, everyone. we'll close it there and look forward to connecting with you in the courses and over the email. Thank you to each person who joined, to the program team, the manager Holly Okara, and our program assistant Margaret Marriott for all your efforts to make today happen. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.